If you've visited Winnipeg's parks and river trails lately, you've probably noticed more encampments. More and more tents are popping up, like these that we saw on a quick boat ride along the river. And Winnipeg isn't the only place they're showing up.
There's visible homelessness and people in encampments from coast to coast to coast in this country, and the numbers keep growing.
In Winnipeg, the latest street census 2 years ago found about 1,300 people were experiencing homelessness. And Homelessness Winnipeg estimates that number has since gone up to 4,000. Meanwhile, a recent Probe research poll found about half of Winnipeggers surveyed don't think people experiencing homelessness should be allowed to stay in encampments as long as they like. It all has us wondering, is it legal for people to stay in encampments in public spaces? The answer is more complicated than we thought. I'll explain, but first, let's meet Teresa Bauer. She lives in a tiny tent near the Assiniboine River, and she invited us to see her home, despite being exhausted from harassment in the encampment that kept her up all night.
I have my bed and my blankets and my pillow. It's cozy.
It's cozy?
Yeah.
How do you feel about your home here?
It's kind of shitty because it's kind of shitty. But I'd like my own place.
Teresa's been living mainly on the streets since she was 12, when she escaped from an abusive foster home. Her brother, sister, and aunt also live in the encampment. She says her connection to family is essential, even if she found a home.
I'd probably still come out here anyways.
Why?
Because I have family out here.
So for Teresa, one of the stipulations of housing might be living near her family. This type of need falls under a legal premise called accessible housing. That's a fundamental part of a new framework guiding Canada's response to homelessness. Homes must support each individual's needs. That can range from a home that allows pets to one where you can use drugs to one where your family members are nearby. Experts say finding homeless people accessible housing improves their chances of staying housed, and that's becoming the law.
People need to have security of tenure. It needs to be habitable. For Indigenous folks, it needs to be culturally relevant. It needs to be in a location close to services and things that people need, and it needs to be safe. We know that encampments are not the solution. The answer to encampments is adequate housing.
Last July, there was one tent.
Understanding accessible housing is important when neighbors start taking action to get them moved out. Teresa Hunter lives near some encampments on the Assiniboine River, and she alleges several in the neighborhood have been threatened and assaulted by people living in encampments.
My husband being one of them. Somebody asked him for a light. He didn't have one, and so he had a hatchet waved at him, and that was right on the river trail, right not far from here.
Hunter says she's contacted the city hundreds of times about fires, garbage, and aggressive behavior.
We are really pressing the city to do something, and do something more beyond than allowing people to live in camps. People need to have shelter, and they need to be supported.
Not bad. But what happens when people in the encampments don't want to leave? Can they be evicted from a public space? The short answer is, it's not that easy. Remember when I said the right to accessible housing is becoming law? Well, the legal framework is still evolving, but rules are already being established to protect the rights of people who are unhoused. At the international level, housing was recognized as part of the right to an adequate standard of living in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Canada agreed to be bound by this agreement, including the right to housing. At the national level, the National Housing Strategy Act was enacted in 2019, recognizing housing as a human right. Judges have ruled Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which protects the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, includes housing rights, even if that housing is in an encampment.
So until there is adequate housing available for them, governments need to recognize they've got to they need to respect the basic human rights of people. So meaning that they have an obligation to provide safe drinking water, for example, a place to cook, a place to keep warm, a place to be to cool down.
Which brings us to the municipal level. In 2008, the BC Supreme Court set precedent by laying out two key criteria for eviction requirements this lawyer knows well.
The two important takeaways of this decision, number one is that it applies at night. And that's because the court noted that sleeping is a basic human right that's essential for life, liberty, and security of the person. And then the second is that the shelter spaces have to be accessible, and there have to be enough of them to accommodate the people who would be evicted.
That precedent is being recognized by judges in other provinces. That means cities have to prove in court the people they want to evict from an encampment would have accessible housing appropriate to meet their individual needs. An Ontario Superior Court judge determined recently one Kingston encampment's proximity to a service hub and a supervised consumption site was essential to the people who lived there, so they couldn't be moved immediately. In Winnipeg, the city only evicts encampments that are on private property or are causing an immediate risk to safety. That has a lot of neighbors complaining. Encampments are keeping them from visiting parks. Many point out the camps can break municipal bylaws on things like fires and sanitation. But the courts have found local bylaws are less critical than the campers' constitutional right to life.
They're subject to all sorts of health effects and possibly death from not being able to sleep. And so we can't weigh the people who are using the park for leisure the same as people whose lives are at risk. We have to weigh the people whose lives are at risk higher.
So instead of enforcing the bylaws, some cities, including Winnipeg, are stepping up to mitigate the risks the bylaws are meant to prevent. Firefighters and police are doing regular check-ins, and the Downtown Community Safety Partnership launched a program this spring called Mindful Cleanups.
Morning, DCSP, anyone home? We don't basically interfere into their privacy or anything, so that's why we try to just come over here, give them some donations, give them some garbage bag that gives them motivation to clean up their space, and that's the way we can build a relationship with them.
The hope is these relationships ultimately help outreach workers connect people with housing. The province says it's working on building more units that are barrier-free.
People need to be successfully housed with supports. People were being housed, I would go to a shelter, they would be housed, I would come back 6 months later and see that same person. And I would often ask them, why are you back at the shelter? And they would say, well, they didn't have the supports that they needed to be successfully housed.
It's not easy to get on to find a place.
For Winnipeggers like Teresa Bauer, a home that takes her needs into account would be life-changing.
That's all we want, is to have a safe place.
Until a safe space is found, Bauer says she'll keep staying in encampments, and the law will continue to protect her and others across Canada.